the Triathlon Show 385. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of that Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode we have the fourth Q&A of the year, and this one is on the topic of run training, in particular in a triathlon context, but we also have some questions about road running, marathon running, trail running, and so on. James Teagle, a scientific triathlon coach, is my co-host for today, and he has been on the podcast before, so you have probably heard him already. But as a quick introduction, he's been with Scientific Triathlon for around 6 years at this point, and he's himself a very handy triathlete. He races long course triathlon professionally, but also has a background of many years in elite short course racing. As you'll hear in the episode, we had more questions than we had time, so this is part one of the Q&A, and in a month or so we'll tackle the rest of the questions for a part two of this Q&A on run training. We probably can get in a few more questions for that one, so if you want to send in more run related questions for our part two, then you can do so. Just email me your questions and I'll add them to the document, and we will tackle them, as I said, in a few weeks' time. Before we get into the Q&A, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. Precision Fuel and Hydration help athletes perform at their best with electrolyte and fueling products, and with free online tools, education, and a patented sweat test. You can use the free Fuel and Hydration planner on their website to get a personalized plan for your carbohydrate, sodium, and fluid intake. And you can also book a free 20-minute video consultation to chat through your plan with the athlete support team. You can get 15% off your first order by using the code TTS23 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to ZEN8. The ZEN8 Indoor Swim Trainer is a unique Dryland Swim Trainer that allows you to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency. It is a perfect tool to complement your pool and open water swimming, as it allows you to do very specific power and technique work, including working your catch and your core activation, and it makes it easier to stay consistent even when you can't go to the pool. You can try the ZEN8 risk-free for up to 30 days, so if you don't love it, just send it back, and you can get a special bundle including the swim bench and a number of ZEN8 training plans and on-demand workouts on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, here's the Q&A with James Teagle. Welcome back to that Triathlon Show, James. Are you ready for a bit of a Q&A?
Hey, yep, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, ready for a bit of a grilling. So yeah, can't wait. Should be fun.
Let's get going. We got a lot of questions. I think this is definitely the most questions we got so far compared to the swim and the bike episodes. And I try to order the questions a bit topically, so similar types of questions are after each other. So starting with some general questions, this one I really like. The question is basically the rest between intervals. Should it be walking, running, or simply standing?
Okay, so for most people, I'd say you want to keep moving, just to help remove any toxins, keep the blood flowing, help recover from that rep. There might be specific cases where you're just trying to build up some kind of resistance to lactate, but yeah, mostly keep moving, I'd say. Whether that's walking or running depends on how fast you're running those intervals and how fit you are.
Yeah, I think for a lot of workouts, they almost do what feels best. Like I think for a lot of workouts, it doesn't matter. Basically, what makes you feel best and perform intervals is the way to go. For some workouts, like let's say you're really in the key phase for, let's say, a marathon or a half marathon, I tend to prescribe recoveries as jog recoveries, so that you have to do the intervals, the race pace intervals, with pretty high fatigue, which you will be doing in a race, but that's a specific scenario. And then there are some types of workouts, maybe short, high-intensity intervals, where you also want to keep moving. If you're doing something like 1 minute on, 30 seconds off, or something like that, then the intervals are short enough that you maybe want to keep moving a bit to maintain your VO2. Whereas I think if you do longer VO2 intervals, then personally I prefer standing around there because they are long enough, but you could also be just walking. That's my take on it. Anything to add there, or should we move on?
No, I pretty much agree. I just go by what feels best, unless you got a specific reason to have to do something like stand there or or different.
Next question: should you run hills if you're going to race on hills?
Ideally, yes. I live in Cambridge, UK. I race hilly races, and so there's a lot of people I train around here. But yeah, I generally run hills. It's completely flat around here, so it can be quite hard. And so anyone who's in a similar situation to me, you can do things like some gym exercises, maybe even on treadmill, putting out a gradient. Gym exercises that can help squats, step ups, deadlifts, lunges, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, there's differences in stride length, and it helps muscular endurance. So yeah, if you can run hills, I would run hills.
Yeah,
It's a lot easier.
I don't have anything to add to that. Just one thing that I'm always kind of thinking about, and I don't have a good answer, is if you do have hills around you, or well, you have the option to do a treadmill workout, would you do a lot of your general endurance running on hills, but then some workouts when you want to hit specific paces, you still do them on kind of controlled a track or flat road, or would you do a lot of your race specific workouts also trying to really simulate the race course there? What's your take there?
I would try and mix up the terrain a bit. So if you're doing your aerobic runs or even things like tempo runs, I don't see an issue with going in the hills as long as you can manage the load and as long as you can manage the intensity. I think it's probably even a good thing if you can do that. So you probably use heart rate instead of pace to do that. But yeah, I'd certainly include some hills if you've got enough training history to handle it, and you can handle the load basically.
Yeah. The next question is from Simon. What do you think about the run-walk approach? So, for example, run 10 minutes, walk 1 minute for long training runs. Is it as effective as running continuously?
So it'll help give your muscles a little bit of a break, so you use slightly different muscles. I think it depends on it depends on who you are and how much training you've done and what the aims of that particular session are. So if you're just building up into running, or building your volume, or potentially you're getting into a marathon running block and you haven't done that much running before, then yeah, I could see that being really useful, and helping to prevent injury. And if you are injury prone, then that could be something that helps get your training load up and time on legs up. So yeah, for some runners, I can see that being really useful. I don't think all runners need to do it at all, because to be honest, you probably do get a bit more out of just running. But yeah, in particular instances, there are cases that, yeah, you probably would prescribe run walk and it'll be the right thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I have one athlete right now, for example, who he's coming back from a surgery 6 months ago. I just started working with him and we do a lot of run walks, but that's not long runs. That's every single run. And that's a common scenario. You come into training from not having done anything for quite some time, then they're really useful. I think that this question is asking specifically about the long runs, and maybe in the context of somebody who does have the experience, are they still useful? I don't tend to prescribe them, but I can see that they could be actually underutilized, and for a lot of people, even though I don't necessarily prescribe them personally, it might be as effective to do 10 minutes run, 1 minute walk as just straight running, or pretty close anyway. It all depends on, I guess, where you want to focus your training. What is the objective? Is the long run itself the objective? Again, if you are just working to finishing your marathon, then maybe it is useful to be just running, and practice that. But if your key runs are some intervals later in the week or early next week, then maybe you get as much aerobic benefit out of the run walk, but you can save your muscles a bit more. So for me, I think they are underutilized, and I personally also underutilize them, but I do think they are in a lot of cases effective, even though we don't necessarily use them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're running in hills and your heart rate is going high, then and it's in zone 3 or zone 4, and you should be doing an aerobic run, then that's a good time to walk. That's just a different take on it. So it's not the wrong thing to be walking sometimes in your aerobic runs.
Yeah,
but not. That's probably good.
Next question is from Paul. What is the long-term pathway for improving running speed and thus running economy? I think that's maybe a little bit of an assumption that it's not. If you improve running speed, it could be a lot of things that you improve, but that's the question.
I mean, honestly, definitely just long-term consistency and increasing volume over time definitely will help you with the running economy side of things. You got to do other things as well if you want to get fast. But things like staying injury free, very important, and time in zone 2, very important as well with that. So generally, it's a very broad question. I'd just say generally the old adage is running a lot of the time easy and spending a little bit of time running hard and incorporating a bit of strength work and running drills. And if you're ready, some plyometrics. That's a general answer, but it's a big question. So I think it kind of covers it.
Yeah, it covers it. I think a lot of people are kind of aware of a lot of running, most of it easy, some of it fast. I think one thing that a lot of people are still aware of, but maybe don't practice as much, is the injury prevention side of things, which might be different for different people. But strength training is a huge part, and for some people it might be mobility, that sort of thing. So
I also see that as injury prevention means not doing things too early or not doing
absolutely.
And so there are some small things you can do maybe to improve slightly quicker, but there is no shortcut here. It takes time to build up.
Really patient build up. And the 10% rule, I think, is like the biggest myth there is almost in training. I think that's for a lot of people. Of course, when you start out, if you start with 1 kilometer, then it's really a small increase. But when you get to running 50 kilometers a week and then you increase by 5 kilometers, if you do that every week and it gradually gets even more, then that's just too big of an increase. So that's not something to follow. I think you just need to have a very patient build up over a long time.
There's also no problem with just keeping the load the same for a little bit, right?
Oh yeah.
You have to increase every week.
But that's what the rule not necessarily implies, but a lot of people interpret it that way anyway. All right. So the next question is from who is it from? And I lost the name here, but it's my friend had a hamstring injury at the end of the season last year. She's now able to return to running, but her heart rate is through the roof. And traditionally, she's a lower heart rate athlete. Most of her runs have been in zones 4 and 5 for heart rate, while her RPE is much lower than that. She doesn't use a chest strap, so presumably the heart rate here is from the Garmin on the wrist. Is there any advice to offer for this situation?
Get a chest strap. Because wrist straps, you just can't. Your hand moves around too much. So the data there is, I don't want to get in trouble here, but it's probably when you're running hard anyway, probably meaningless. If it was taking somewhere on the earlobe or somewhere on your head that wasn't moving, great. But chest is also good because it's not moving that much. But your hand and wrist are just moving too much, to actually get an accurate measurement there. So I get a chest heart rate monitor, and then I retest your zones. You could even use the 20-minute test to do that, or some kind of test. But I wouldn't rely on the wrist heart rate monitor at all.
I'm actually in a situation now where I have lost my heart rate monitor. It's somewhere here in my room, but I can't find it. So for the last few days, when I've been running, the heart rate that is recorded is from the Garmin, and I make sure to always go in and delete it in Training Peaks afterwards because I don't want to be confused by incorrect data. But I mean, this situation does occur even if we can rely on data with some. I don't know if that's the case here or not. The data might be inaccurate, but it does occur in athletes that do have a chest strap. So if we assume that that's the case, I think in this situation there are some things like low plasma volume after you've been out after training, so that causes heart rate to go higher. As you say, you can retest your zones, and they will probably be different after a time of detraining than they will be after a time of training. So my general advice here in a situation like this is to, if it's a somewhat experienced athlete that knows how to use RPE, then just use RPE for a while, and then over time things will start to align again like they were before.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how far the injury is here, or it might not be.
It said at the end of the season last year, so it's been a few months. Let's say 3.5 months, probably.
So you could probably do some kind of testing now, if you feels like it's no longer an issue. But if not, you just build up gradually, like you say, by RPE, and then you go into testing if you want to get those heart rate zones correct. Anyway. Yeah.
The next question is there a validated method of calculating caloric expenditure from run power?
Honestly, I don't really use run power that much, so I'd have to say I'm not sure if it's a validated method. I mean, you could work it out probably one for you here, Michael.
Yeah, I don't think there's a validated method. I think, first of all, power from different sources are very different. If you compare the power that your Garmin calculates versus a Stride pod, or the other sensors that might be out there, they are all quite different. So that doesn't mean that they might be useful in terms of pacing and so on, but it's it's not clear what exactly they are measuring, or rather calculating from certain measurements. So it's not mechanical power. It can't be, because we can't measure that without strain gauges and things. Is it metabolic power? Well, you can't really measure that without gas exchange. I think Stride released some white paper that they kind of aim at correlating well with metabolic power. So it should correlate with the oxygen consumption if you do a run on the treadmill with gas exchange. But it's not, I don't think that you can say that, well, they have the exact kilojoules spot on, even if the correlation is good. So no, I don't think there's a validated method of calculating caloric expenditure from run power. I think that there's a good rough rule of thumb, which is your body weight in kilograms times the number of kilometers you run. So if you run 10 kilometers and you're 70 kgs, then 700 kilocalories is what you burn. That's been validated on a track. So if you run on a hilly course, then it's going to be very different. But it's relatively stable to different speeds as well. So just using body weight and distance for a fairly flat route, you can get a good estimate. But the other question there is, why do you need to know your caloric expenditure? Yeah. Because it's, even with bike power meters, it's still an estimate. It's not really useful for a lot of things. And yeah, I don't know why you need that, because even if you could track that, it's a lot harder. You can't track your swimming calories. You can't track your basal metabolic rate. Are you going to go in and measure that? Are you tracking all of the things that you're doing outside of training? There's not that much point in doing it, I don't think.
I mean, I just don't. I mean, running power useful, but not actually that useful, I don't think, if I'm honest. I don't really see any of the runners that I'd look up to using it. And I don't really find it that reliable to use. I mean, so I don't use it. That's just my general take on run power, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I don't use it at all either. I can see the pacing aspect with it, but even though I don't personally use it, but I definitely don't think that calculating or trying to track caloric expenditure from it, that's not the good use of it as a tool. The next one is another more technical question: lactate monitoring. What lactate levels to target during a threshold workout? Hot topic.
So the best way to do this is honestly to go and do a step test and get your own individual values. So not to rely on generic numbers, because it probably won't be accurate. Generally, if you want to pick a number, but it kind of is just picking a number. You probably say around your second threshold is going to be around 4 millimole per liter. But yeah, I mean, the best way is to go and do a step test and get your individual values based on your own lactate turn points, and not rely on generic numbers. Is what I'd say there.
I think that's the only way to do it. Like if you pick 4 millimoles, then that's the same as picking. I'm going to do my threshold. It's like picking 220 minus age, or picking my threshold runs is going to be 160 beats per minute, or even without knowing your actual zones. But even then, I think that I would question the utility of testing. I think that doing a step test is great if you have the opportunity. It's not something that you have to do. It's a bit more of an icing on the cake thing, but it can be useful. I don't necessarily think that the testing within workouts to really fine tune things, I have a hard time seeing that would be helpful for 99.9% of athletes. I don't think it's really a good use of resources and energy.
I mean, there's times when you might want to use it if you're, for example, doing a tempo session, or you're making sure that your lactate is staying low enough, or you want to know what it is, for example, at the end of a time trial, that kind of thing. But like, honestly, I've been in these performance environments as well, and like, we were using lactate, but we weren't using it anywhere near to the same extent. I don't think people make out you lose lactate. You use it. It's an interesting number to have. But like any of these data points, you use it in combination with other things. And so I know there's a big thing around using lactate with what Norwegians are doing. But yeah, I still think that you probably don't need to use it as much as is being made out in the media.
I saw a really interesting new paper released quite recently that they basically did. I don't think it was a step test; it was a ramp test that they did. But they measured everything: oxygen consumption, lactate, and all sorts of things, and heart rate, and they basically wanted to see what is the day-to-day variability in things like VO2 max, lactate at certain power outputs, and so on, and see basically see the day-to-day variability. And lactate was an order of magnitude more variable than all the other things tested, like more than VO2 max, than heart rate, and so on. So I think if you go and do a ramp test and you get your I can see where my curve tilts, and this is my second lactate threshold, then you associate a heart rate with that. That's probably the best thing you can do, or a pace, especially if you run outdoors. But a pace indoors on the treadmill, I think still heart rate might be the better one to associate to the lactate itself. But then if you try to use that exact lactate number, let's say it's 4 millimoles, then, well, on one day it might be 4, but then on the next day it might be 3.2, and on the next day it might be 4.8, but your heart rate might be within 2 beats per minute or 1 beat per minute every single day. So I think that heart rate and pace or power, those are more accurate to use. So associating them with the actual turn points on the lactate curve.
I mean, and I know people want specific numbers and to know this is X, and but you're not a machine and you will change daily. So that's why ideally give sessions by maybe a range of heart rate or a range of power rather than just X power. Yeah.
Right. So moving on to a few running race prep questions, race training questions. So we have a number of marathon questions from Mohammed. First of all, what are the long run distances that should be done in the different phases of training for marathon?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this fairly generically for an intermediate runner. So I'd say the longest run is probably going to be around 20 to 21 miles. And you probably start building those long runs around 16 weeks before the event, in which case that would be starting the 5 to 8 mile mark. That's very broad because it really depends on who you are. Again, I'd say your long runs probably consist of around 30% of your weekly volume. Again, if you're doing triathlon, that might be slightly different, but that's a general good rule of thumb. And then to periodize it, I'd say you'd want to do about 8 to 12 weeks of build of a base, 4 to 8 weeks of build, and then a peak phase of around 1 to 2 weeks, and a taper phase of about 1 to 2 weeks. The base phase there is to focus on building endurance and developing the early aerobic base. The build phase is where you start to introduce high intensity workouts, and the peak phase with probably more race like intensities. And then obviously in the taper phase, you bring down the total training volume and allow the body to recover before you race. Does that?
Yeah, it makes sense. 20 to 21 miles, that's 32 to 33, 34 kilometers, something like that. 31 to 30. I think for an intermediate runner, that's exactly what I would say. I think for a beginner, a first timer, I would say trying to do at least 30 kilometers, maybe 32 kilometers as their one longest run, building up to that. For an intermediate, I agree with that kind of 32 to 34. For somebody running, let's say, going for a 250 or faster, 250 to 230, 34 to 38. And if you're going for sub 230, I would say you got to do a 38 kilometer, maybe all the way up to the marathon distance in training.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously doing it a lot faster. The faster runners do it a lot faster, spend a lot of time, a lot less time on feet. So actually, you look at it time-wise, it's probably pretty similar, right?
But that's also specific to the race, because the slower runners spend more time out there on race day. So I think that makes sense. All right. And during the different periodized phases, should I include intervals, hill repeats, and long base work runs into the same 4-week cycle?
So I think first of all, know what you want to work on and focus on that. You could probably include all of these things, but for most people, I'd say you wouldn't want to work on everything at once. So it kind of depends on the course, and it also depends on your individual training history and what your strengths and weaknesses are, and the ability to handle the load. I'd say for a marathon, the long run is essential, but you got to build it up gradually. Then you've got the marathon specific sessions with a bit pace, intensity. I'd say that's also fairly important. And then if you can build hills into the runs, then fantastic. But just manage the load properly and make sure you're getting the basics right before trying to make it too complicated. A lot of that time should be spent aerobic, zone 1, zone 2. And I think you got to get that in and not focus on too much intensity until you've got that nailed, basically.
Yeah. If you try to do all the workouts, fit them all in, then you easily run into issues with just trying to do too much and too intense work. I think a good way to go about things is, well, you don't necessarily even have to do any testing. You might just look at your racing history. What is your 5K PB and 10K PB? You can identify then, well, am I stronger on the endurance side or the speed side? Get a bit of a kind of critical speed calculation from that, or even just eyeballing it. If you're relatively experienced, it's easy to see where you might be missing something, and that can be used to inform what is your weakness, what is your strength. And then obviously when you get closer to the race, then the key thing to do, no matter what your weaknesses or strengths are, is the race specificity. And I guess that's
go on. Sorry.
I was going to say that leads into the next question, which is how one moves on from the general fitness to specificity training for a 42K for a marathon.
So I'd say, you just want to start about general consistency and frequency. So as I said earlier, you want to establish that aerobic, I know, cliche base. You want to establish the aerobic base because you want to have the miles in your legs to be able to then add on intensity. So if you're, a real beginner runner, then you're going to take a while to do this. You wouldn't want to be attempting a marathon probably. I would say probably in your first year. I know people do, but you want to build up a lot of frequency and you want to build up the volume via frequency. And then you start adding the intensity in once you feel that you've got a good handle on the frequency. General fitness specifically to 42K, I'd say, if you are a beginner, I'd extend that base period, maybe adding a bit of intensity, but not too much. And then as you get close to the race, you start adding in a bit more intensity and start making the sessions look a bit more specific. A lot of that though, if your first marathon and it's the first time you've really done anything like that, you can't really go wrong with zone 2 running. Just make sure you handle the load correctly and don't increase too much, because the biggest kicker with a marathon is if you get it wrong, you'll get injured, and then that's all that training gone. I think that answers that. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so. I would add, for me, the key thing when moving from the general preparation to specific preparation would be that the long runs would become marathon specific. So before that, maybe you just do you could do your long runs just as easy aerobic runs. But then when you move into the specific phase, I would include the marathon race pace in the long runs. So I like doing things like 3 times 6K marathon pace, 3 times 7K, 3 times 8K, depending on how far you go, how advanced a runner you are. I would build up to, for a pretty advanced runner, 3 times 10K with 1K easy jog in between. So those sorts of workout. Obviously, for a more beginner, they would look maybe a lot less. You would have less of a total volume marathon pace in there, but also the difference between your marathon pace and your aerobic pace would be a lot smaller. So it's not necessarily as taxing anyway in that sense. But I would say including the marathon pace in the long runs is the key thing for me.
And then, you wouldn't, I know I've generalized it a lot, but I'm not advocating just doing zone 2 all the time. I think if you are, in that base period, I think if you are a more advanced athlete, you've got some history in the sport, then you would probably be doing some faster sessions in the week. What that would be would depend on your strengths and weaknesses. So it wouldn't be a case of just going from no intensity to then adding some intensity in, but that intensity would be controlled and it would serve a specific purpose. And it would depend on who you are before you started implementing it into a long run. That's how my approach would be anyway. It might not be that specific. It might be VO2 reps or something that you were doing. It's just not going to be the first bit of intensity you do.
And the final question here from Mohammed is, how do you build speed at the end of a marathon to ensure one finishes the last 5 kilometers strong? This is a fun question.
This is I mean, I was chatting to my friend about this. He's run a 214 recently, and honestly, he was doing some crazy things. But I think the best thing to do would be, you got to pace it right. If you want to finish strong, you got to pace it right. So you got to have a realistic pace expectation of negative split it basically. So don't go out too hard. Negative split it and have realistic expectations. Obviously, your nutrition. So if you can train your gut, go out on these long runs and train with a nutrition that you're going to be using on race day, so you don't have any surprises. And then see what you can handle. A lot of people can't handle as much in the run as you would on the bike. And then also take into account things like conditions. If it's really hot, then you're going to be running a lot slower, probably. And then, you could training specific wise, you could build in some strength work, include some hills, maybe that help with muscular endurance side of things. Like you could probably do some of these runs as like build runs, that kind of thing. So you're increasing the pace towards the end, which is basically a negative split anyway. But I think if you can get the race specific stuff right, so the pace, the nutrition, and being smart in the conditions, then you'll finish as strong as you should finish at the end of 42 kilometers. Anyway.
Yeah. It's not, the question asks how do you build speed, but it's not about building speed. It's about having really good endurance to maintain the speed, and pacing it right is the absolutely most important thing. And then nutrition, hydration, as you say. I don't have much else to add there. If you've done your key marathon specific sessions, let's say you've built up to 3 times 10K, then you know exactly, okay, what is the pace that I can do? What is the pace that I can't do? And you can pace that accordingly. And to do those sessions, you will need to fuel and hydrate well, so you get that practice as well. So really, it almost comes as part of just getting through the training period. If you have a good specific build up in the last few weeks and maybe up to a couple of months before the race.
Yeah.
And the next question is from Everett, who writes, I plan on doing a lot of trail running this fall, culminating in my first trail half marathon. I'm a bigger athlete at 89 kilograms and struggle going uphill. Conversely, descending is a relative strength of mine. I am wondering what I could do in training to either minimize my weakness or maximize my strength.
Okay, so, I mean, if you're, you could probably, you got to carry the weight uphill, right? I mean, I don't know your build, that could be perfectly healthy, but it probably is. I'm not, 89 kg, you're probably taking a bit more non-functional weight than you should be uphill. So obviously that would make a big difference, whether or not you want to actually address that, because, it might not be an issue. You might not, that's up to you, but obviously that's the big thing, I'd say. You could incorporate more hill running, thinking about what your stride is thinking about the length of your stride, that kind of thing. When you're running, building a bit more strength work in the gym, adding things like squats, adding things like lunges, making sure your calves can take the trails uphill. I mean, but if I'm being honest, if you lost a bit of weight, then you probably run a bit faster uphill. But I don't really want to say you should, because I don't know if it's healthy for you or not. But 89 kg is obviously quite heavy for a runner. I hate saying things like that, but that's probably the case, right? Yeah. Did you have anything to add there, Michael?
Yeah, one thing to add is with trail running, with uphills, it's sometimes difficult. Pacing can be really difficult because you don't actually know how long the hill is. Like you end up going with the runners you think you should go with, and then you realize that this hill that you thought was 5 minutes is actually 35 minutes, and then you screw yourself up and end up walking to the finish. I've done that. I've also taken the car to the finish. But so actually knowing the course, I think, is really important in trail running, because you can't always see what's going on, and then doing specific training on trails to know, okay, how hard can you push it up a 2-minute hill versus a 10-minute hill if you have that terrain around you. That's the one thing I would add. Obviously, the training effect is crucial there, as you already said, but also the pacing effect, just knowing what you can and cannot do. And I would also say with trail running, even more so than marathon running, I would say a negative split is important. Negative split in the sense of not necessarily time-wise, because you can't really, it's not important on trails, but in terms of feeling strong at the end. Because if you go out too hard the first half and then you start to feel tired on trails, then you cannot use your strength for going quickly downhill. You start to lose coordination and you start to stumble and potentially fall, and everything just falls apart. So really conservative pacing when it comes to trail running, I would say, is critical.
And then, when you're running downhill, you can really batter your legs, right? So, just like you say, pacing, but also thinking about, whether it's smart to be running that. I mean, I don't know which race you're training for, but whether it's smart to be running that fast down that hill, if you got plenty more hills to go, maybe that's something that could help when you go uphill again. Just knowing when to use your strength and when not to.
Yeah. I think for trail running, the gym work can be really critical because of that factor, the amount of strength needed, both going uphill and downhill. Right. So the next set of questions are about triathlon run training structure. And the first one here is running with power. What field assessment protocol to use for pinpointing MLSS or 70.3 power?
Okay. So as I've already said, I don't necessarily use power, but you could probably use some kind of step test and take the power from there if you think the power is reliable, and that would correspond to somewhere in your third zone, so somewhere just below threshold but above zone 2, which is aerobic. The other way to do it would be just to determine your critical power using critical power tests. So I think Strider have one which is 3 and 9 minutes. You could use 3 and 9, 3 and 12, and use the formula to work out critical power. And then basically for 70.3 triathlon, I'd say it's going to be somewhere between 75 to 90% of critical power that you're probably running in the race. Mid-pack athletes, probably, mid to high 80s in terms of critical power. That would be the best way, I'd say, other than just going out and doing a 70.3 and looking at what it is, and then pacing it better next time. But that would be my protocol for that if I was going to use it with power. I'd probably use heart rate or RPE, a mixture of heart rate, RPE, and pace to pace them, if I'm honest. Power, that's how I do it.
So my answer is that you could use the exact same test protocols that you would use for any. It doesn't matter if it's speed or power you're looking at. The test protocol would be the same. If you're doing a critical power test, then do a critical power test. My preference is using 3 minutes and 20 minutes if doing critical power tests, but you could use 3 and 12, 3 and 9.
The only reason you wouldn't use, you would do a 20-minute power test, but the problem is if you're trying to keep your run power up to date, is actually, a 20-minute test quite frequently is a lot of load on the muscle, and a lot of load on the body, and you can kind of get away with that when you're cycling, but I just find that it does take a bit more out of you run-wise.
I think it depends on the athlete there. Like advanced athletes, I almost never do run testing, or never. Like I try to get my athletes to do like a 5K or a 10K, and that's the testing that we do, and not necessarily having to do both, but just getting a race result from an open run, and then you can use that and compare to triathlon running, and that's all that's needed, really. You don't. So in running, I agree. I am quite careful with testing, but I think with more beginner, intermediate runners, the impact of doing a 20-minute test isn't so hard. It's not like running 250 kilometers for 20 minutes. If you run, let's say, a 5K in 20 minutes, I think it's quite different. So you could do that, but it depends on the psychology as well, how the athlete perceives a 20-minute test versus another test. And again, you could, if it's easier to do a race, you could just use a 5K or parkrun or something as the test. But the point isn't whether to do the test or not, but it's more so that it's the same test that you use with power as you would use with speed. Like it's no different. If you want to test lactate, then a ramp test. If you want to test VO2 max, then a gas exchange test. If you want to test critical speed, then a critical speed test, and the protocols would be the same. You just take the power data and correlate, and that's useful. But then obviously take the speed data as well and get all the data that you can, the heart rate data. Use all of the data to when you interpret the testing. All right. Next one is: does it make sense to do speed/interval running when you're training for an Ironman? This one is from Takuto.
Yes, I'd say for some athletes and no for other athletes. So it really depends on your injury history. And the thing we have with triathletes is we probably haven't built up the same amount of load as pure runners. So that's the first thing to think about is, what is the most important thing here and what you're trying to achieve. So if it's just trying to get around the Ironman, then you might not need to or might not want to. If you want to go a bit faster, then you're targeting a time goal, then I'd say, yeah, it is important. Obviously, what happens on a bike is really important to what happens on the run and Ironman. So you can't just think of those two things in isolation. But yeah, if you can determine, you have a weakness or you see some kind of hole in your program, maybe you're trying to work on your economy in terms of maybe your cadence or something like that, or then I could see why you'd want to do interval work. And a lot of athletes do interval work. I set my athletes, most of them, interval work, but it's all there for a purpose, and it depends on the time of year as to what that purpose will be. Doing something 20 weeks out from a race, you can be doing something that's not that specific, but actually you see as a bit of a hole in their profile that will help come race day. In terms of maybe it's like acting as a ceiling if you're working on VO2 max work. Maybe if you're, lacking a bit of strength, then you want to be doing hill repeats, that kind of thing. But yeah, so yeah, to fill up a waffling answer, for most athletes, I probably would but it has to have a purpose. But there is certain circumstances where you wouldn't want to.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think it's all about the timing. So as you said, 20 weeks out, that's a completely different thing than 5 weeks out from the Ironman. When you get closer to the Ironman, then for some athletes you might still do it, but for a lot of athletes you might be only focused on just getting in the specific training, so specific race pace, maybe a little bit faster than race pace, but still those long aerobic intervals, so not really speed training at all by any stretch, and some brick runs off the bike just to test that your bike pacing and run nutrition is on point. So it's a timing question. I say that yes, it makes sense, but a lot of the faster running would come a bit farther away from the race, and then when you get closer to the race, then you would be focusing more on the race specific work. Next one from Simon: for 7.3 and full distance, what do you think about never running faster than race pace in training and have all intensity done on the bike?
I think we kind of just covered that one. But yeah, never running faster than race pace in training. If you're injury prone, then maybe. It depends on the athlete's goals and limiting factors, for sure. For an injury-prone athlete, to be honest, I'd be looking to build up robustness and address the injury concern and what's causing that before committing to an Ironman, because you're doing a 26-mile run at the end of a bike and you're going to be very fatigued. So I think that would be the first thing I'd look at, if I'm honest. But yeah, if you were injury-prone and you're in the block of actually getting ready for an Ironman, then you might consider, especially not including things that are a bit more high risk, like, I don't know why you're doing this close to the race, but like VO2 work, that kind of stuff, whether you're running downhill fast, those kind of things, or what surface you're running on would be really something you probably think about. But yeah, an Ironman is not something to travel with. I know it's really popular, everyone wants to do one, but I'd actually look at the injury concerns before committing to the Ironman, because it's probably going to be something that comes up and bites you. If you are going to it as an injury-prone athlete and you're already committed to it, then yeah, potentially you would want to limit the intensity, and you could get quite fit for doing it on the bike. Things like your running economy probably will suffer for that, but you probably will be able to complete the race. You definitely will to.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And what else was I going to add? I think it depends a lot on what your speed is. Like, let's say you're a very fast runner off the bike. If you're doing, I don't know, a 120 half distance run, then you can get a lot of quality training without running faster than race pace, because a 1:20 half marathon is about 3:45 to 3:50 pace per kilometer. So that's you can get good quality training done with that. Whereas if you're thinking of race pace as a 4-hour Ironman or 3.5-hour Ironman or 5-hour Ironman, then it might be slower than what you actually generally run your aerobic runs. So depending a bit on who you are. So I think it's a very broad question when we're talking about 7.3 and full distance, and it really depends on the athlete. But yeah, I think it. If you're not an injury-prone athlete, then I think that if you want to improve your run, your running is not like really fast already, then you want to be running faster than race pace. But if you are really fast already, then let's say you're world class. Let's say you do a 29.5 minute 10K off the bike in an Olympic distance race. Well, I know some of the training, and it's a bit different for everybody, but some of the athletes that are racing at that level don't really do much training faster than that pace ever, and they're running really fast. So, but that's obviously a whole different pace. So I think that's my point here, is that it's very relative to what your race pace is and where you are. So the answer can change completely if your race pace is 2:55 per kilometer or it's 6 minutes per kilometer.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'm a bit dissatisfied with that answer. I don't know if I made it clear, but I think your initial answer was a good one. So that's all good. Let's move on to the next one. I'm training for Olympic distance and do a lot of additional bike events. My weekly workouts consist of 5 bikes, 2 swims, and 3 runs. What is the best distribution for my running? I currently do 1 long run, 1 hour 30 to 2 hours, 1 interval run of varying intensities, half marathon pace to VO2 max efforts, and 1 45-minute easy run with strides.
Okay, so I wouldn't try to make it complicated. Obviously, you'd want to have a purpose for every session, and as I've already probably hopefully made clear, that I think you can't underestimate the importance of an easy or aerobic run. So don't just add in intensity and quality to get rid of those runs. I mean, you are doing an easy run and a long run. What I'd say is, if you're training for Olympic distance, I don't necessarily think you need to be doing a 2-hour run. I mean, there could be a good reason why you're doing that, but I don't think, for most people, I don't think a 2-hour run would be necessary. If it's just time at, doing something longer, then I'd probably be doing that on the bike, if I'm honest. Less injury risk. So I'd say, yeah, I'd look at the frequency, because I think the frequency of running. So maybe if you were doing a 2-hour run, or even like a 1 hour 45 or 1 hour and a half run, you might want to split that if you're focusing on Olympic distance, so that you have more running. An interval run, for sure, that makes sense at certain times of the year. I'd also look at what pace you're going to be running off a bike. So this is a very person specific, but you might be running in zone 3 off a bike, you might be running zone 2 off a bike. So if you're running in zone 3, I'd be including something more like a tempo run, and that tempo run is just below lactate threshold or lactate turn point 1. So that might be something you want to include. But yeah, I'd look at the frequency. I'd say you probably don't need to be running 2 hours, but there could be a good reason why you are in your circumstance. And I might look at adding a zone 3 run in there if you got the other stuff nailed and you can handle the load.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. I'm also looking at the 2-hour run or up to 2 hours, and I think that's excessive for an Olympic distance, and that time and energy could be probably spent better by breaking up that run into 2 shorter runs. Maybe one of them could be that tempo run, and or, as you say, doing some longer work on the bike. But it sounds like he's already biking a lot, so probably 1 or 2 of those bikes is quite long. I think the general principle, if you have 3 runs, if that is your capacity to run, because you're focusing more on the bike, you do a lot of additional bike events, then 1 long run, long aerobic, 1 interval run, and 1 other additional easy run, aerobic run. I mean, that's a good template, but it's going to, at some point, you're going to be limited by your amount of running. So it's all about what your goals are. If you get to a point where you're plateaued, you're running, then I don't think there's any other option than trying to do some more running if you want to improve your run. So you just have to realize that with 3 runs, there's only so much that you can do.
And I mean, I get the temptation to be adding that. So maybe that's why he's doing the 2 hour run, right? Because he's like, well, I don't have the time, but I would split that up if you can, because I'm not sure you're gaining from that. And the longer you're running for, right, the probably your form is getting worse. So, it's not a massive injury risk, but you could be running with bad form, and you might, it's probably a bit more increased injury risk, right? So I'd rather you did 4 runs.
If anything, like let's say his interval run is 1 hour total and he has the 45-minute easy run, I would rather do then the long run be a maximum of 90 minutes, so 1 hour 30, and then increase the 2 other weekly runs to 1 hour 15 and 1 hour 15 both. That would be about the same amount of total volume as if you have the 2 hour long run, but split up more evenly distributed. And I think that there's value in making those other runs like a little bit longer, but not quite as long as a proper long run.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with that.
Right, let's move on to the next one, which is from John, who writes, it seems to be a common enough view that one should avoid high volumes of run training and intensity for age groupers in order to prevent injuries and focus on building endurance through swim and bike training. The question is, how far can this go? What are the limitations to this approach, and what do you need to take into account?
Okay, so avoiding high volume of run training and intensity for age groupers to avoid. Okay, so I'd say, I mean, this is a specific question, and athletes don't all come in the same, not all the same. So I've got older athletes who do a bit more volume than probably the majority, and I've got some who can't handle it as well because, maybe just look when they started, before they started working with me, or, that kind of thing. So I'd say, I mean, you can get fit out of doing swim and bike training. What's going to really suffer is your running economy, and running economy is important. So I'd say most athletes are probably spending under half the amount of time they spend on the bike running. A time crunched athlete probably does close to a swim run time. Just, you could swim a lot more, but don't have time. And I don't think pro athletes are really doing much more than half the running versus biking. So just because the injury threshold is higher with running than it is cycling. So, I mean, the limitation would be that you probably don't develop a good running economy. Your run specific muscles are probably not developed so much, and there's an increased injury risk. So if you want to be running faster, I'd say you probably need to be running more frequently. But for most athletes, and that's probably the top end of age groups, that kind of thing. Or if it's your weakness, then yes, you probably want to be running a bit more, but you don't want to get injured as well. So it's a balancing act. So what can you handle? What's your load history, and what can you do consistently? Would be the key questions there. But I mean, if you are injury prone, you're a bit older, and you could definitely get a lot more bike training in, and your general fitness would improve, and that would generally help your run fitness as long as you're getting some running in. Does that answer that question? It's a bit of a rambling one.
I think it does. I think you said it's a balancing act, and I think that's exactly right. It's a balance between what is the individual athlete characteristics? Are they injury prone or not? That's a main one. Secondly, what are their goals? Are their goals to become faster, or and where does that increased speed come from? Can it come from swimming or from biking, or does it have to come from running because they're kind of tapped out on their swimming and biking gains, or the running is more of a weakness and more of a low hanging fruit? So there's just a lot to. I don't think you can. I wouldn't say that. I disagree with that. It would be a general consensus that one should avoid high volumes of run training and intensity. I disagree with that, but I think it certainly makes sense for some athletes.
I think high volume running is different. It's relative. So a high volume of running would not be the same as a high volume of swimming or cycling.
Exactly. Nobody's for an age grouper. I think if you run 5 hours a week, that's quite a lot. That's a lot. Yeah. So even a lot of it. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So I think that's the beauty of triathlon, that you can be on a relatively high running volume, but it's actually not anywhere near what you would have to do as a runner. So in terms of injury risk, it's still a lot better. But I'm just looking at this question. What are the limitations to this approach? I just think you nailed it. The specific adaptations, the running economy, and also some of the specific metabolic adaptations, getting your threshold up to a high percent of your VO2 max. Like, you can probably get a lot of the VO2 max adaptations. You can get a bit of a crossover from cycling and swimming, not a complete crossover, but you can get quite a bit from that. But I think things like getting your threshold to a high percentage of the VO2 max, that's a lot more difficult without actually running quite a bit.
Sure. And I mean, you can think about things like, I mean, this isn't answering the question, but for those athletes who are, a bit worried about, think about what you're running on. I know, I'm not going to generalize, a lot of guys in the States here, especially like ones who live in Florida, they don't really seem to have that many trails, that kind of thing. Whereas, UK-based athletes, a bit more luckier, we have a lot more trails. I know there's some places where you can, but think about what surface you're running on. Not trail as in really technical, but something a bit softer underfoot. Maybe running on grass instead of asphalt. That kind of thing is also going to help. And maybe incorporating a bit of strength work where appropriate, and that's going to help as well. So that's a bit off topic, but.
The next one is from Antoine, who writes, when I do a half-distance triathlon, my heart rate is at threshold heart rate, and my pace is about 4:15 per kilometer, so 1:30 for the half. When I do threshold runs in training, my pace is about 3:50 to 3:55 per kilometer. What is the best way to train for a half-distance triathlon? Should I run at my race pace of 4:15 per kilometer, or should I run at my race heart rate, which is that faster 3:50 to 3:55 pace?
Okay, I just have to read this question again. So I think he's saying, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that he's trying to run threshold off a bike. Is that what he's saying?
I think it's open runs in training. So just general threshold runs in or what pace is. I don't think it's regarding brick workout specifically. I think it's about general race specific runs, going out and doing, 10 by OK at race pace, and should he focus on his race heart rate, which leads to a higher pace in training, or his actual race pace, which is slower in a half distance triathlon?
So
I can answer it first, maybe, because I think I get the question, and then you can say if you agree with me.
Go on. You go first. I think I got it, but go for it.
Yeah. Well, so I think you can do both, but I think there are two kind of slightly separate, not like crazy different, but slightly separate workouts. So when you do a threshold run, if I prescribe you a threshold run, I would say that it's the 3:50 to 3:55. Let's say you can hold that for about 45 minutes at least, and that's probably your threshold. So that's a good intensity to train at and do good workouts at to try to improve your threshold. Whereas there are situations when you get close to the race, when I would also say that you should go out and run at that race pace, which is 4:15. And brick runs would be one example, but it could also be some longer runs with longer intervals, something like 45 by 3K with short recoveries of that 4:15 per kilometer. So I would prescribe the threshold run and the race pace run. I would prescribe them off of pace. Heart rate is what it is. I think the discrepancy that you have here is that when you're doing a half distance triathlon, you've been out there for 3 hours, 4 hours when you start the run, and it's getting hot. You're dehydrated already. Like, heart rate is always higher when you do the run in a triathlon, especially in a long triathlon, compared to what it would be at the same pace in just a workout. So you can't really compare it in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you can't compare. I mean, generally, if I'm chatting to an athlete about racing and their race heart rate, I'd say you want to keep it a few beats below threshold in a 70.3, probably because there has been a bit of heart rate drift. And then for less experienced athletes, I'd probably recommend a bit lower and say high zone 3 heart rate due to the lack of comparison. And then
I think this fits well with this guy, because he's pretty fit, right? Running 1:30 and he can hold his heart rate at threshold in that race, so it works well.
There is going to be some heart rate drift, but I'd say you want to keep it a few beats south of threshold off the bike, and then if you've got the experience, you can say by RPE. Once you get, I'd say around 10K. If you get to 10K, then you can probably push on or keep it the same.
All right. So the next one is from Michelle. Triathletes in general and masters triathletes especially have to treat running very carefully to avoid injuries. Any advice on the proportion of run training to bike training that should be done? We kind of touched on this already.
Yeah, I mean, as we said, it's person specific, so it depends on their background, their injury history, the amount of time they got available to train. I'd say a very general rule of thumb would be 2-to-1 or less, so 2 times the amount of cycling or running. But that's very general. Probably so general that you could almost discard it. But yeah, that's a very general rule. As proportion run training to bike training.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on how much total training time you have, because if you have 8 hours in a week, then the proportion might be a bit higher because you just don't have so much time on the bike. But if you have 12 hours, then it makes sense. You can get in 6-7 hours on the bike, maybe 3 hours on the run, and 2-3 hours on the swim. I don't know what that adds up to, but about 12. So then, I think that general rule of thumb, it makes sense, but it requires a certain minimal volume, because at 7-8 hours of weekly training, the bike proportion, you don't have time to put in all the hours on the bike. So then I think the running becomes a little bit of a higher proportion. But I don't think the proportion of run training to bike training is what you should focus on for injury prevention. It's more about the volume of running in itself, the frequency of it, and the intensity that you're doing. More so than the proportion, because that will depend on how much bike training you're doing, which doesn't necessarily impact your injury risk. The next one is also from Michelle. Depending on the age of the athlete, consistently doing even one track session per week can be risky. Any advice on how to safely do higher intensity running, so race pace or faster?
So, it can be a bit more tricky, but I think it can be tricky for an athlete of any age, but definitely it's increased. I got an athlete in his 60s currently who's doing high intensity stuff and, with no issues. I think generally you want to check form and look for imbalances when starting with an athlete. So simple things like, can I do the same amount of calf raises each side, that kind of thing, or glute bridges? I know it's simple, but if there's an imbalance, there's a different number, and or it's particularly low, then there's probably going to be an issue there. And then when you start introducing intensity, it should be very controlled and not introduced before you've introduced the volume and the frequency of your sessions. So it's that general aerobic stuff. And then for an older athlete, when you do introduce it, you probably would start off a bit more progressive than younger athletes. So you wouldn't be taking so many jumps, and the jumps shouldn't be too big anyway. And I'd also be looking at surfaces. So, what are they running on again? If you're running on asphalt or tarmac, then I can't remember what the study is, but one of my guys I was talking to was saying about apparently tarmac is 8 times more force back than asphalt even. So just things like that, right? Just think about what you're running on. Try and make it a softer surface. Does it have to be track? I mean, even running around the bend on track, if you're not used to it, that kind of thing, that could lead to an injury. If you're introducing track sessions, do it cautiously and don't increase the volume too much too quickly. So intensity control, check the form, make sure it's appropriate for the athlete's injury history and what they've been doing before, and then also surfaces. Check what surface they're running on and think about that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is consider doing hill reps, because the slower speed when you do the same intensity on hills, that is a very good risk mitigation strategy, but it also depends a little bit on what your weak points are. So if you struggle with maybe something like calves and so on, then it can be hills can actually be worse probably. But for many athletes, I find hills to be a good option to track. Yeah, I mean,
it's slightly different. Things like your form, your stride lengths, and where you land, even your turnover might be slightly different. If that's something if that is purpose is just to get that high intensity work in, then that would definitely work.
Yeah. Next sectional question is on brick workouts or brick runs, and the first one is: should I do brick runs all year round or only leading up to races?
So I think brick runs are really useful, but I think there is, again, when it comes to running, there's an increased injury risk from doing brick runs because you're running tired and you're running fatigued. So For most athletes, I'd probably say not, unless time availability is something. So going back to our athlete earlier, if he's got good form, he was only doing 3 runs. If he's got good form and he can run off a bike, maybe that would be, just time-wise, enable him to run off a bike a bit more running. But yeah, in general, I'd say you want to be doing it before races. Yes. I don't really look at Brit runs as building any kind of like physiological benefit, more psychological, and actually just getting used to the muscular, getting used to how it feels to be that fatigued running off a bike. And as you said earlier, checking nutrition, that kind of thing. So there's definitely a place for Brit runs, in my opinion, more towards the race specific time of year. Also, yeah, just check. Don't do too much and then don't progress it too quickly, just in case you're running a bad form and can lead to injury. Yeah, that's pretty much what I think there.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add. I agree with the one reason that I would give brick runs far away from races would be exactly that, time availability. If it makes it easy to fit in some extra running, then it can be a really good tool in the toolbox and useful. But for specific, let's say, adaptations or training reasons and so on, then I wouldn't do brick runs other than in the specific period when you're getting closer to racing. But in that case, I would do them for all of the reasons that you mentioned already. Next question is from Van. In half and full distance training, the standard brick run of a long or longish bike is usually 20 minutes. Is this sufficient? Is there any benefit in going 30 to 40 minutes every other week?
So, standard 20 minutes. For my athletes, the guys coach is probably 30 minutes, just because it is a bit longer and it gives a bit more time to things to settle down, see how you're feeling. Everyone always feels a bit weird for the first 10 minutes. Going to 30 minutes I don't think is an issue. Again, it depends on the form and the athlete's background, how well they can run off a bike and what the form looks like. For some athletes, yes. It basically, in the same way as like some athletes would benefit from a long run/tempo session, the key question would be how much is the athlete's form deteriorating and what else they do in the week and have they progressed to that point. So I wouldn't go straight into a 40-minute long run off a bike, and I'd have to have a purpose behind doing it. But in some circumstances, yes.
Yeah. I think there's a big difference here between half and full distance training, or at least, and also the speed of the athlete. If we're talking half distance, but it's an athlete doing a half distance in 6 to 7 hours, then I would definitely want to have some longer brick runs, even getting towards an hour for maybe one of them, because they're going to be out there for quite a long time on the run. Whereas the faster athlete, 30 minutes is fine for a half distance. For full distance, I would like to build it up to have at least one brick run that is an hour long.
I'd look at the purpose of it. So for me, running well is all about consistency and not getting injured and building up time on feet. Because ultimately, if you can do that on the long run, you are going to be a faster runner. Other alternatives I'd say is, I'd look at why are you doing that? If it's nutrition, then yeah. But also, you could be doing your long run and maybe the next day, that kind of thing, when your form isn't so bad. I just look at, don't make it too long if you think your form's going to deteriorate. I know you're going to have to manage
for me, it's pacing and it's nutrition, hydration. It's those three, and just that's the way that you're going to have the best idea of figuring out, did I pace myself well on the bike? What is the right pace for me on the run? How is my nutrition working? And if you have a couple of those 1 hour runs leading up to an Ironman, the first one often doesn't go so well, but for the second one, you can correct those issues. And then that can give you some confidence that, okay, now I actually know what my pace is. It's definitely not a training, like you need to build your run fitness with them. It's about the pacing and the nutrition and hydration. All those three things are so critical to the race that I find it valuable to include them.
But I agree with you. But I probably wouldn't be doing that every week in a 10 week.
No, not every week. No, it's more like
2 or 3 times. That kind of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's like a marathon. Like you're not doing a 32-kilometer run every week. You're building up to it. Maybe you do it twice, but it's the same way that I see those longer brick runs. Just doing 2 or 3 of them.
You don't want any surprises on race day with nutrition, that's for sure.
Yeah. Most brick training covers running after biking, but not biking after swimming. What is the reason for this?
Honestly, I think it's just practicality. So, I mean, when I was at Loughborough training for Scott there, we used to do plenty of bike to swims. I mean, swim to bike stuff. But honestly, like, is your pool going to let you take your turbo and put it on poolside? For most athletes, the answer is probably not. I think there is, running off a bike is a bit more intimidating than, and then, the nutrition questions we just went over, that's more of a reason to do it off a bike. But I think if you're looking at sprint and Olympic distance, especially where the intensity is probably a bit higher, or even, coming out of a swim, if you're not so good at swimming or the swim's been quite hard, then that first bit of the bike can be quite hard because your heart rate's really high. And for some athletes, that can be a bit off-putting. So, I think if you can practice that, you probably would. It's just, can you actually practice that and the logistics of it? I mean, if I have athletes who have the availability to do that, we will do things like that. But as I just said, it's can you actually persuade the pool to let you put your turbo on poolside, or do you have somewhere safe to leave your bike while you're in the lake? I think that's what puts a lot of people off that idea.
I think for me personally, I've done a bit of open water swimming and then just having the bike in the car locked away and done a pretty quick transition, and that's been quite fun actually. I only done that a couple of times really, but it was a nice kind of change of pace from my normal training, and I found it quite useful. But I think that in general, I would say that the swim to bike transition is really important for short course racing, or more, and especially the higher the level, obviously. So then it makes sense. If we're talking half and especially full distance, then the swim is more of a, well, at least for a full distance, it's definitely like a warm up. So you don't really need to practice the biking after swimming. But whereas practicing the run after the bike, again, to me, is a lot about the pacing and nutrition hydration. So that's why having the long bike and then seeing how you can run off of that is useful. And I think the same principle, although to a lesser extent, applies for half distance. So I think that there is, I do think that for long distance athletes, it is more important to do the bike to run for those reasons, just ticking those boxes. But there is a place. I think it has some value to the swim to bike if you can, and especially for shorter distances, it becomes more important than longer distances.
I mean, for those short course distance sessions, they're probably doing that kind of thing off the back of a threshold set. So you do something like 2100s at threshold, and then you get out and you do 5 minutes hard on the bike, just because that simulates the race. How it would be. And then, I know this is a very small demographic, but maybe if you're racing pro 70.3, you want to do that as well, because basically the first couple of minutes in a competitive 70.3, you're going to be spending at VO2 because you're going to have to get around people because of drafting rules. And then, that might apply as well for some top age troopers. If the marshals are being on it with the drafting rules, then I could see benefit for that as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's cover a couple more questions, and we still have half of the questions to go, but we can maybe pin that for another time because we won't get through them all today. Let's just do 2 more racing and pacing related questions. The first one is from Jeremy: socks or no socks on the run? And if no socks, how do I train my feet not to get blisters?
This depends. Again, it depends. I know people hate that. It depends on what the difference is going to be. So if you're racing pro level, and you're trying to win the race, or you're at top end of an age group and you're trying to win the race, then a couple of seconds might count. And, from personal experience, I actually won a 70.3 basically by going through and just, having a fast transition to everyone else. But if it's a longer race, maybe an Ironman, or maybe if you're not trying to win the race and actually those seconds don't necessarily count, it's quite a bit of risk. And do you want to take the risk of getting your feet chewed up? Basically, there are things you can do. So if you got no socks, then and you know where you're going to rub, one of the things I personally do when I race is I put the blister plasters in the shoes where I know they rub, and I know it sounds ridiculous, but super glue them into the shoes so they don't move. So that instead of rubbing against like what the stitching or whatever, you're rubbing against something a bit less solid, and that tends to help. And it's not perfect, but it tends to help. It kind of depends on what your goals are. If you're trying to win the race, then definitely there might be some point in doing that if you're willing to take the risk. But if you're not trying to win the race, or actually if the race margins are going to be a bit bigger than 15 seconds, then putting some socks on, if you do it fast, is not going to hurt.
Yeah. I think one thing to consider is what do you have coming up after the race, especially if you, in some cases, you might know that, okay, I am going to get blisters, but it's fine because I don't have any other. I'm going into my off season, and I want to be competitive. I want to save every second I can. But let's say you have another race in 2 weeks, then you probably shouldn't take the risk if you know that you're probably going to get blisters, because that will keep you out for a week at least of running, potentially, depending on how severe they are. But that would be my experience. I think that a lot of I don't know a lot of people, but quite a few people can get away with not having socks for a 10K in Olympic distance, or 5K for sure in a sprint distance, but not half marathon in a 713. So I think that's kind of where the limit is, and at least personally, that's how I would think about it. If I would do a sprint or an Olympic distance, I would have no hesitation going sockless. If it's a half distance, I used to do all of my half distances without socks, and I actually started getting a bit worse issues with blisters. So now I generally do it with socks. But if I was going into a race where, like, whatever the race scenario is, I know that it can come down to, like, I'm chasing a certain place or a certain time, and then I know that after that race I don't have anything else coming up that is important in the next few weeks, then I would maybe take the chance of going sockless, and maybe now try to use your plaster tip. And
if you're running no socks, try not to pour water on your feet, because that really doesn't help. I find that tends to increase the risk of getting blisters. So when you're going for the aid stations and you're tipping water in your head, just try and not get it on your shoes if you can. I know it's not always possible. Well, one other tip, I've put just a lot of Vaseline in the shoes, and that seems to help some, but it's probably not as good as the plasters. It's not a foolproof strategy. It does help some, I think. If you want to get them out again, though, then it's probably a better idea, because that's super glue and they're stuck. Yeah. It does work, though. Yeah. All right. Well, I think this is. Sorry. One more question. I promised. Racing and pacing. This is from Sam. I'm racing a swim, bike, run event. 1500 swim, 50k bike, mountain run, 50k bike, 1k beach run. The middle run portion is up and down Mount Snowdon, involving a fair amount of walking and scrambling. Last year I paced by feel, occasionally checking my watch to make sure I wasn't pushing above threshold heart rate. I have a stride power meter, but found it wasn't a very good gauge of effort when things got steep and I had to walk. How would you pace yourself in such an event? So, I mean, heart rate, I'd use heart rate for sure. Again, as we discussed earlier, though, you might want to give yourself a bit more wiggle room. I mean, the big thing if you're running at Snowdon will be your legs will get trounced. So heart rate might not even if you keep the heart rate nice controlled, even if you pace it well, it's going to be the legs that are going to be the issue, because you get top of that and your calf's going to be burning, quad's going to be burning, and then you're going to run downhill again, and probably not going to help things too much, and then you got to get back on the bike. So honestly, I think this is one of those where you've really just got to go by RPE. So use heart rate, but also RPE. If you blow up or your legs go, or you start cramping, then you're in trouble in this race, because you've got a long way to go once you've even done the run. You've still got to bike back to the beach. I would honestly go by RPE and underdo it rather than overdo it, for sure, because if you do cramp up, you're going to pay for that later on the bike. And it's a serious run, that. Heart rate you can use, but the legs are going to probably be your limiting factor. Yeah. Do you know how long that run segment is? I'm not sure which way they go up. I've run it a couple of ways. What is it? I think it's about 10 kilometers. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm kind of guessing. I've done it before, but I can't remember. It's steep. It depends which way they go up, how steep it is. anyway, it's going to be fairly tough. It's no direction is going to be anything to trifle with. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I don't have anything to add really. Mostly feel some heart rate. Yeah, that's the way to go, I think. All right. Well, thank you everybody for sending in a lot of questions. As I said, I've gone through one double-sided paper of the questions already, and we have one other double-sided paper of questions still to go. So we'll try to cover them another time. But I have a coaching call coming up. I think that James, you do too, have some meetings. So yeah, we need to pin it here and resume another time. Thank you everybody for the questions. Thank you, James, for taking the time, and catch you soon.
Always. Speak soon, Michael.
I hope that you enjoyed this Q&A. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com, and be sure to check out our previous Q&As, including the one on bike training with Lachlan Kieran and the one on swim training with Jack Hutchins that we've done earlier this year. I also did a solo Q&A on season planning, goal setting, and personal limiters very early on this year. Next Monday, I interview Dr. Bent Rennestad, who is a very well-known figure in the sports science world, and we'll discuss 3 topics that, if done right, have great potential to improve endurance performance: interval training, heat training, and strength training. And it is a really good interview, and I'm really excited to have Bent on, so make sure that you tune in for that one. If you want to improve your triathlon performance and want help to achieve your goals, then consider working with a scientific triathlon coach or training plan. We have options for athletes of all different levels, for different budgets, and no matter what the size of your goal is. A few points to mention to reduce the barrier to get started is that we have no minimum commitment term nor startup fees for coaching. And for training plans, we have a 100% satisfaction guarantee for plans purchased on our website, and an exchange guarantee, so you can exchange your plan for another plan if you purchase through Training Peaks. We also have consultation and customized plan options, and you can find out more on scientifictriathlon.com and contact us to discuss your specific goals and needs and see what's best for you. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use the free fuel and hydration planner to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs, and get a specific and effective race strategy, and book a free video consultation with the team if you want to refine it further. Use the code TTS23 at checkout for 15% off your first order. And thank you to ZEN8. Use the ZEN8 Swim Trainer to improve your technique, power, stamina, and swim training consistency. You can try the ZEN8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get a special bundle including the swim trainer and a number of ZEN8 training plans and on-demand workouts on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.